So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming out to our event tonight. This is the 4th event in our annual Discover Islam Week. We also have another event tomorrow at 6 p.m. in the Interfaith Room. We're going to have a Tumblr famous chaplain come in named Usama Isa. He's known as Party Till Fajr, and he's going to be talking about Islam in the media. This year for Discover Islam Week, we decided to have a focus on social media and the arts. So if you guys actually step outside later when you're leaving and you look at the glass cases, we have a showing of a bunch of Islamic art pieces from local artists as well as student artists. So tonight we're going to have a talk by Omar Offendum followed by performance.
Okay, so my name is Ahmed Abdul. I'm the Irish chair along with Shimyan.
I didn't introduce myself.
Sorry, okay, it's cool. So a brief bio about Brother Omar Offendum. He went to high school in Washington, D.C., went to the University of Virginia, where he studied architecture. He dropped an album in 2007 called Syriana Americana, and he actually missed a step. He went out to LA, and that's where he lives now. We're very honored to have him. Without much further ado, Omar Offendum.
Since you guys are all sitting down, I think I'm going to sit down for now, if that's okay with you. Assalamu alaikum. Before I begin, I just wanted to ask, do we have any non-Muslims in the house by any chance? All right, that makes me very happy. Welcome. You've just officially been converted. I'm just kidding. I just want to start off by saying it's a pleasure to be here, it's an honor to be here, and it is most definitely a responsibility to be here. I say it's a pleasure because I always love performing in OH. Oh. Hey. Last time I was here was actually at a small school a couple hours away called, I don't know if it's a couple even, called Heidelberg University. You guys familiar with that? Tiffany? I say it's an honor to be here performing on behalf of the MSA. I want to thank you guys for inviting me. Abdurrahman's actually the brother who first sent the invitation, and his older brother, Ammar, had actually been part of a group of folks who invited me to speak and perform at Mizzou last year. So it's cool to kind of see the family. And it's a responsibility to be here, not just because I'm Syrian or Arab or Muslim, but because I'm a human being who believes in equality and justice for all people, full stop. That's what drives me and my work, and that's what makes events like these so important to me. And I want to thank you guys for taking time out of your busy schedules to come here and to experience this. Now, I've been asked to basically have a little discussion. I wanted to tell you a bit about myself, my life story, my narrative, if you will. And then open up the floor to some questions to see if we could get a little Q&A going and have, that back and forth reciprocation that we need to build up the energy and hopefully lead into a nice little performance at the end. Now, before I get into that, I wanted to ask, how many people have actually heard my music or seen me before? Okay, cool. So more than half the room has not. That's good to hear. It's always nice to have people. I like it. So where do I start? Let me see. You gave a very brief intro, but I'll just take it a bit further back. My name is Omar ibn Abdul Latif ibn Muhammad al-Shaqaqi. My parents are both from Syria. My father, Allah yarhamu, was from the city of Hama, and my mother from the city of Damascus, which is in fact the capital city. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? All right, cool. Now, I was born in Saudi Arabia. I was the youngest of four, and I was born in the eastern province of Saudi, in Khobar. I heard we have a lot of Saudi students here, but they don't show up to these events. Do we have any Saudi students? No, okay. Tell them how dope it was next time you guys see them. So yeah, the eastern province of Saudi is where my father ended up relocating. You could say in many ways he kind of saw the writing on the wall of what was happening in Syria. The father of the current dictator, Bashar al-Assad, was ruling Syria at the time, Hafiz al-Assad. And him and his brother were unfortunately responsible for a massacre that took place in the city where my father was from in 1982. The city of Hama suffered a really, really horrific crackdown, killed somewhere between 10 to 40,000 people. And this was literally 1 month after I was born. And my father did his best to help out his fam and his friends back home, helped to get them to find jobs in Saudi and then subsequently in the US and to immigrate. And that ended up blacklisting him. He was never allowed to go back. This is a familiar story for many people, not just people from Syria, but from all over the world who experience this kind of stuff, the brutality of dictatorships. My mother, on the other hand, was from Damascus and always had a love for Syria that ran very deep, and she wanted to instill that in us. And so I had this kind of interesting duality, one parent who wanted to look ahead and leave Syria behind and focus on the future, establishing our lives here in America. He's very proud of the fact that we could come here to this country to plant roots, to attend universities, to graduate, to get jobs, things like that. My mother always had her eyes and her gaze set back east and always wanted to move back. My father ended up passing away when I was 12 years old, and so she ended up moving back soon after that to Syria, almost 10, 11 years ago. My sister went with her as well. So I had a very interesting kind of back and forth experience. But when we moved here to the States, at the same time, coincidentally, the ambassador to Saudi Arabia had started an Islamic school in Washington, D.C., the greater D.C. area. Is anybody from the DMV by any chance? One person. There we go. All right. Virginia, Maryland?
Fairfax.
Fairfax. Okay, cool. You familiar with ISA?
Yep.
Yes, he is. So the Islamic Saudi Academy was established in the 80s and was opened up to people from all over the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. It was initially started for students of, or rather children from the parents of the Saudi embassy. It was one of the largest embassies in the country, but he had opened it up to everybody. And so anybody who wanted their kids to get an Islamic kind of education, an Arabic education, could send their kids to that school. It was almost fully subsidized by the government at the time, and so it was pretty cheap. And what you ended up having was a very interesting mix of students of very different socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds. People straight from the Middle East, from South Asia, from Southeast Asia, from Africa, and then Americans, African Americans, and even a few non-Muslims actually sent their kids to the school in the beginning, back when I first started. It was a very interesting place to grow up, I must say. And hindsight is 20/20. I feel very blessed to have gone there. And now, looking back on it, I was able to learn Arabic fluently. We had both the textbooks from like Saudi Arabia for Arabic and Islamic studies, so kind of like Saudi curriculum, which then ended up complicating things later after 9/11, as you can imagine. Or maybe not, if you guys weren't even born by the time 9/11 started, I don't even know. And then, and then at the same time, we had the local Fairfax County curriculum. And so it was a very interesting place to kind of go to school and grow up as a Muslim kid, as an American kid, as a Syrian kid, all these things I identified with. And I remember studying whenever you study the Arabic language, you inevitably end up studying Arabic poetry. It's like the backbone of the language, and we're talking thousands of years ago, really ancient texts, and even stuff more recent. And side by side to that, I would be bumping, Nas, Tupac, whatever it was, in my headphones on my way to school. And so I had a very interesting kind of sonic backdrop. The juxtaposition of the two led to some very curious situations where I would talk to teachers and I'd say, hey, I feel like Nas is kind of saying the same thing that Al-Mutanabbi, a really famous poet from the Middle Ages, was saying. Like, what are you talking about? Well, you're crazy, that's ridiculous, da 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 da. But I saw the connection. And one interesting thing I saw was that when we studied this Arabic poetry, they ended up breaking it up into these different kind of sections or themes. Love poetry, aka ghazal, or like flirtatious poetry, love poetry, when you're talking about your longing for a person. Poetry called like Sha'r al-Hamas, to get you ready, kind of get people drummed up for war, get people ready for battle. Medh, praising people, really important people. Battle poetry, straight up like hijab, back and forth, a poet against a poet, representing a tribe. My tribe is this, this, and this, yours is that, that, and that, and kind of going at it. And a lot of this stuff even happened impromptu, freestyling, on the spot. And so these poetic traditions, I saw very close parallels with what I was seeing in hip-hop culture. whether or not the Arabic teachers at the time were able to see that. And this is something that, kind of allowed me to latch on to hip-hop culture a little bit more. In addition to that, I also heard and saw a lot of references to Islam and to Islamic culture in hip-hop. Some of the MCs that I really admired were Muslim. Whether or not they kind of said it blatantly didn't quite matter, because you could hear it in the lyrics. It was very much influenced by not just traditional Islam, but perhaps more so by Nation of Islam and 5% ideology. And you could hear that in the lyrics, like break fast like Ramadan, even reference or referring to oneself as, Rakim Allah, one of the greatest MCs, the God MC, they say. Which for some very traditional Muslims is perhaps problematic, but if you understand the lexicon and the terminology a little bit deeper, you'll see where they're coming from with it, and gives you a different perspective. But anyway, all this is to say, it was a source of pride for me, and it was also something that wasn't necessarily understood by the older generation. And it wasn't until I got into college that I really started feeling open enough to experiment with it myself. I started making beats. Like the brother said, I went to the University of Virginia, not West Virginia. Nothing against West Virginia, but UVA all the way. That's where I first started making beats. I also studied architecture there, so it was an interesting place to kind of juxtapose the idea of architecture, as the ancient Greeks referred to it, as frozen music, and being able to see and make these connections between that type of art and the discipline that it took to kind of... Do they have an architecture school here? They do, right? Does anybody have any architecture school friends? You never see them, right? Oh, you're in the school? Okay, yeah, there you go. It's hard, yo. I mean, you spend hours and hours and hours and many late nights, and so sometimes, like, my only friend was that music man, and of course the people around me. But it was a really great place to kind of be able to open up and study art on a deeper level. The school that I went to before that, Islamic Saudi Academy, they kind of shunned art to a certain degree. It had a perhaps more conservative interpretation of Islam in some ways, or at least some teachers did, and so music was haram. They never taught us music, which is something we can talk about later if you guys are interested. But so it was finally an opportunity for me to kind of open up and experience these things. And so, like I said, I first started making beats, and then from there I started freestyling with friends and started to participate in some open mics. And before I knew it, my friend and I, Tayyib Ibrahim, a Sudanese brother who I'd known since back at ISA, decided to form a little crew called the Nomads, which I was really shocked to find out some of the brothers here actually had that first album, which I really hope doesn't ever see the light of day. This is I'm talking like 10 years ago. But there were some glimpses as to where I was perhaps headed on that record. And there were also some glimpses of things that, man, anyway. Alhamdulillah for everything. You grow, you live, and you learn. But it was a really great experience. Him and I, we called the crew the Nomads. It was an acronym, the notoriously offensive male Arabs discussing shh. And that's where I first kind of came up with the name Omar Offendum. And a lot of people ask me what that means or why I call myself that. And Offendum, does anybody know or maybe have an idea as to what that might be referring to? Are you going to hold your phone up the whole time? That's going to make you really tired. Anybody? Yes?
Like a sir or something?
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of like a title of nobility, if you will, in Ottoman culture and Turkish culture. Effendi is like sir or lord, and Effendim is a possessive form, so it's like my lord, or something like that. And you'll hear a lot of people say it out of respect in the Middle East, Turkey, Egypt, Syria. You'll say it to somebody kind of older than you, say it to an older family member. Even a waiter in a restaurant might say it to you. It's just like a typical respectful way to refer to someone. I spelled it with an O, F-F-E-N-D, and obviously kind of embodying something so offensive on one side of the world, and perhaps negative, and then something so positive, noble on another side of the world. And that duality was what I was trying to really get at with my music, and breaking down those stereotypes was something I always wanted to do. And as the years went on with, being in college and kind of starting to do more of these performances, something really crucial happened halfway through my college career, 9/11 took place. And all of a sudden I went from being just another kid on campus rapping to the Arab rapper or the Muslim rapper. What's he talking about? Where's he coming from? Why is he saying these things? It put a whole new microscope on me in my identity and my perceived identity that I didn't necessarily feel prior to that. You know, my name is Omar. It kind of blends in with a lot of different cultures here in America. I don't perhaps stand out right away as a Muslim per se, as much as perhaps a sister with a hijab or a brother with a beard. And so, you know, before that happened, like, I kind of just blended in. It's not that I wasn't proud of where I was. I definitely would tell people, but it wasn't something that was immediately apparent until I got on stage and started rapping, and then you'd hear me say things or talk about my culture in a way that was very clear. After 9/11, you know, our government at the time started to make some decisions that even our president today is very much against, such as the war in Iraq. And I would be vocal about these things. I would question these things. I remember one night at an event, we were kind of just having a big jam session. It was a live band on stage and different MCs were allowed to come up and perform. And I got the mic and started rapping. I don't remember exactly what I said. It was mostly freestyling, but something to the effect of, you know, not another war, da-da-da-da-da. After the event, an American sister came up to me afterwards, white American sister, and said, Omar, how dare you? You know, you don't know anything about patriotism, you don't know anything about being American. My brother is a soldier and he's going to go fight for this country and you don't know what you're talking about, and da-da-da-da-da-da. Coming at me very kind of angrily in a negative way. And so, in that moment I realized, you know, this could go one of two ways. I could either be like, yo, just shut the hell up, I don't want to deal with this right now, or I could talk to her, and I could try to find some sort of middle ground and really understand, and help her understand where I'm coming from. And so I said, look, first and foremost, I have nothing against your brother. In fact, I have a huge respect for people who are willing to put their lives on the line for something greater. And so for that reason, I myself would want to know that those reasons were valid. Those were the real reasons that we were going. Again, lo and behold, you know, years later, President Barack Obama himself was against the war in Iraq, and we found out that there were no weapons of mass destruction, and that the whole thing was a farce, and hundreds of thousands of people have died as a result, and thousands of U.S. soldiers, and we're still suffering from that in Fallujah and other places, and so, why, you know? Now, we had that conversation. She didn't leave, you know, 100% convinced of my music. She may not have come back to another one of my shows, but she left there getting a little bit more about my perspective, and I left understanding that there were ways to handle situations like these that were more healthy than others. And then, most importantly, in that moment, I realized just how powerful this was. Art, music, poetry, whatever it is. And you're given a platform to speak about issues, especially something like hip-hop, where you can cram so many different words and thoughts and ideas into a song, into verses. You really kind of have an opportunity, and you can either use it as a platform to bring people together, or you can be a divisive voice and, you know, tear people apart. And in my particular position, in my situation, being somebody going back and forth, Assalamu alaikum, go Cavs, going back and forth between the US and the Middle East, it became really important for me to start using this tool in a positive way, and in a way that would really help bridge these gaps in these cultures in a meaningful way, in a realistic way, not just in a kumbaya, let's hold hands and act like it's all good, but let's really talk about things. So, anyhow, I ended up graduating from the University of Virginia. I started working for an architecture firm based in Washington, D.C., continued to work for that firm for 10 years. I relocated to Los Angeles also in 2004. Worked from home, went back to DC a whole bunch of times, worked on some projects there, all while moonlighting as a rapper and slowly building my career as an MC and as a hip-hop artist. Mostly online by using the tools that were available to me through social media. Back in the day before Facebook, there was this thing called MySpace. I'm not familiar with it. But even before MySpace, I remember having a really interesting experience. It was like one of the very first songs I ever recorded. We're talking about way before social media, really. I mean, some of the very first instances of it where people were creating forums online. This is how old I am. So we were putting up music online with like real player, just kind of like little widgets and just putting up songs and seeing people comment and stuff. One song we did, we put up anonymously. It was written from the perspective of a Palestinian suicide bomber and an Israeli soldier, so kind of like a back and forth conversation. And this was like 1999. Some of you probably weren't even born then, right? We put up this song, and I had never experienced this before. It was kind of a very, very big revelation to me, but we started getting hits from Berkeley to Australia, and, you know, people commenting in the UK, people commenting I don't know where. You know, never heard African-American brothers rapping about Palestine before, and things like that. It was really eye-opening, you know. And in that moment, I saw just how powerful this was, and that's why I kind of kept using the internet as a tool for that. And so, like I said, you know, MySpace and then different sites that would come up after that would become very important, you know, as an outlet. And not only for me to put my music out, but to also reach out to people around the world. I worked on a project very early on, also called Free the P, which was kind of like the first compilation of hip-hop and spoken word dedicated to Palestine. This was like in the mid-2000s. And we used the proceeds from that record, and it featured people like Immortal Technique, Dem from Palestine, a whole bunch of people. And we used the proceeds from that record to support Slingshot Hip Hop, which was a documentary that was being made about hip hop in Palestine. And so music that was created all across the country, being sent to us in Los Angeles, was then being compiled, put on an album that actually got distribution nationwide through the Ryko Warner catalog, one of the first Arab American products to kind of get nationwide distribution. And it was being used to raise funds for a documentary film about hip-hop growing in Palestine. So these kinds of international connections were being made vis-a-vis the internet, and they were really just a natural reflection of our life. It wasn't like, you know, we were doing this necessarily very intentionally. It was just how we were living. We had friends back there, we had friends here, and this is how it all happened. And aside from supporting, you know, initiatives like that, I found myself being invited to perform at many different kinds of fundraising events and awareness-raising events. People saw the connections between Palestinian activism, between you know, kind of anti-Islamophobia, I guess, if you will, and the work that we were doing. And they were starting to invite us out. And it just started to grow even beyond just the Arab and Muslim kind of circles, where we were doing fundraisers for Hurricane Katrina and for the floods in Pakistan and things like that. All the while, I was slowly kind of building a network of artists that I could kind of reach out to and collaborate with, beat makers, MCs, poets, things like that. And this all eventually led to creating, writing, and producing my first album, Syriana Americana, which actually wasn't 2007, it was 2010, 11. So many years of kind of work and collaborations and things like that that led to that. I had a bunch of different little records before then, but this was kind of like my first solo piece, you know. And there's a lot of songs on there that kind of reflected these kinds of ideas that I'm talking about. And I also did some interesting things trying to take from my past studying poetry in school, and so I decided I could maybe translate some of that poetry into English hip-hop songs, like Damascus, like Finjan, written by some very famous Arab poets. I also wanted to do the opposite. I figured if I was going to be translating from one language, I should definitely do the opposite and translate it through the other. And so I took poetry from Langston Hughes, translated it into Arabic. And so these kinds of things, I was playing with these ideas that I felt were really important to kind of give a bigger perspective about me, my life, first and foremost, but then also our experience here in general. I found that, you know, after 9/11, a lot of Arabs, a lot of Muslims in this country were like, we are not terrorists, we are not extremists, we are not this, we're not that. But didn't take enough time to tell people what it is we actually are, you know. And so that was a really big piece of the album as well. Lo and behold, 2011 rolls around, and some big things start happening in the Middle East. The media referred to it as the Arab Spring, although that actually never was a reference to it in the Middle East or in Arabic at all. It was really revolutions taking place. Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, a lot of this stuff you guys are probably very familiar with, you know, and country to country, this wave of, you know, self-determination, if you will, started to spread. It's music. Yo, he talks a lot, yo. And lo and behold, it comes to Syria, and things come full circle. And all of a sudden, this country that I'd always known, as I said, through the lens of my father's experience and my mother's experience, started to become, you know, headline news every single night. And what started as a very small protest in like a southern border town, Daraa, ended up exploding into a nationwide. Some people refer to it as a civil war. Some people refer to it as a crisis and a massacre. Some people refer to it as genocide. Some people act like nothing's happening at all. Very strange things taking place inside and outside of Syria. But most importantly, I started to put out music that reflected those experiences, at least from my perspective and my family's perspective. And as I said, I have immediate family there, extended family there, lost family members as a result of this massacre and what happened in 1982. So this is something that I hold very close to my heart. And it's not some sort of like revolutionary high horse I'm trying to ride. I'm trying my best to speak from that personal perspective and let people understand how it affects me as a person, as a Syrian, as an American, and most importantly as a human being. Anyway, I've been speaking a lot. I feel like some of you guys are familiar with my work, some of you aren't. I'd love to share some of it with you. Before I get into any of that, I just wanted to know if there were any questions about anything that I've said so far, or any thoughts, any feelings about anything I've said so far. Yes?
How did your family react to the way your career was going?
How did my family react to the way my career was going? That's a very good question. In fact, I want to tell you a little story about the first time my mom heard me rapping. And, very funny, actually. So I had recorded something, brought back a CD to my sister's place, started playing it, and then my mom walked in the room, and she had a very similar reaction to what you heard earlier. She walks in and she's like, very good. Who are these African Americans rapping about Palestine? So my sister's like, it's your son, Omar. And she's like, oh, wow. You know, it was mixed. Like, it was a sense of pride, you know, that because in many ways, the love for poetry started with her. And she had introduced me to poetry of Nizar Qabbani and Mahmoud Darwish, which is a very big influence on me. These are two modern Arab poets. Both have since passed away. They're kind of her generation. And Nizar Qabbani very much represents like the Syrian experience, if you will, and also just a greater pan-Arab experience. Also a lot of love poetry, and a lot of kind of like harsh political critique. And then Mahmoud Darwish was very much kind of the foremost poet of the Palestinian resistance. So between the two of them, I had a very interesting introduction into modern Arabic poetry through my mom. And she sensed that influence in what I was doing. At the same time, she, of course, wanted to make sure that I wasn't being derailed from my professional goals and that I was going to be building a career that could help me, you know, raise a family someday. And all these things were really important to her, as any Arab mother or Muslim mother would be concerned. And then also, you know, being from a Syrian background, you know, it's generally like a keep your nose clean, model minority, don't stick your neck out for anything kind of situation before all this Syria revolution stuff happened. Doctors, engineers, that's about it, you know. So for her, it was a lot of things, you know. So it was, like I said, a mix of like pride and at the same time maybe worry. And then also real talk, because you know my father passed away when I was 12 years old, so she's always wanted to make sure that you know she was doing what both of them would have wanted, you know, and was always wanted to make sure that she would compensate for that, and wouldn't want to a decision like this to kind of reflect poorly, you know, and all that stuff. But most importantly, I think what I was able to show her was that by, you know, keeping my grades up, staying in school, graduating, getting a job, and doing all that, in addition to this, I was able to fulfill an artistic goal and kind of like urge inside me that I know she always had, that she never really got to fully experience. And so, she's one of my biggest fans now. Definitely. And still a huge lyrical influence. Go ahead.
Okay, so you said that some people at the I say they told you that, you know, music was haram.
Yeah.
So was that something that you ever like struggled with as a kid, like the fact that you might be doing something quote unquote haram?
So for the non-Muslims in the house, I know there's a few of you, haram means forbidden, as in you're not allowed to do it, God does not want you to do it, etc., etc., etc. And this is a word that can, man, it can drive a young Muslim American kid crazy. Because sometimes it feels like everything is haram. But the truth is, I think, what I was really blessed with was having parents who had a deeper understanding of what I was going through here, and who weren't as kind of conservative and latching onto everything from, you know, from that part of the world. They understood that by moving here, we had to shed some of this cultural baggage in order to be able to really allow their children to grow here in a healthy way. And more importantly, in their households and the way they grew up, music was not haram. Music is a huge part of our culture, very deep-rooted. In fact, the very first musical notations ever written by man were written in Syria. So this is something that I always kind of grew up having a sense of pride in. And even if, you know, certain Islamic teachers would tell me that was haram, you know, what my parents would always say is, you know what, إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّاتِ, actions are based on intentions. This is a tool, and you can either use it in a positive way or in a negative way. As I said, when I first started, some of the things I was saying as a stupid kid weren't necessarily the smartest, and I gauged from people's reactions, how they reacted to that, showed me, you know what, that's not how you should be using this. Other experiences showed me just how empowering it could be, not just for me, but for other people listening. And I could really see no way that that itself could be haram. I know so many people who've converted to Islam because of hip-hop music, because of rappers that they found very influential, who they then found out were Muslim. I know a lot of people who are able to get through some of the most difficult struggles with their iman, with their aqidah, all that by listening to certain songs and poems and music. So, no, I don't, and I didn't. And when we were at school, honestly, there was also, this is kind of sad, but there was also a very strange hypocrisy that I witnessed, where yes, music was haram, but then if Prince so-and-so was coming to our school, all the kids had to sing some songs for him. And you know, in that there's a bigger discussion about the problems of the developing world, of that part of the world, of monarchy, of nepotism, of all sorts of things that are wrong with our part of the world, that we began to unpack as I got older, and I started to see, you know, things a little bit clearer. But alhamdulillah, I mean, like, I think it's come to a point now where it's very interesting, you know, hip-hop gets a bad rep, obviously, for being hypersexualized, violent, misogynistic, etc., this and that. And Muslims get a bad rep for being misogynistic, violent, etc., this and that. And so I was kind of dealing with both, you know, and I was able to kind of navigate and negotiate and understand both and deal with those types of criticisms better because of Islam and because of hip-hop. So for me, they kind of went hand in hand. You checking with her what the question is?
He wanted to know, he told me so, I guess he can't talk, but he wanted to know if you still are an architect or are you just a musician?
And how were you able to do both at the same time?
So I worked for the architecture firm for 10 whole years, and I had music as like an outlet that I kept on kind of pushing when I'd get off work, when I'd be done. You find the time when you love something. You find the time. You know. I will say this though: architecture is a very difficult field. I do not tell people I'm an actual architect. I'm not a registered architect. It takes time. You have to put in the hours. You have to pass exams. And you have to be certified. I'm not a certified registered architect in the state of California. That said, I'm proud of the work that I did and I do for this firm, and it's a scope of work that I enjoy particularly. I can get into the nitty-gritty of what it is, but I don't do like construction document detailing. I don't do any of the real kind of like, it's more schematic design things that I enjoy, and that's what I got to do for the firm, and that's what I continue to do for the firm. And it was a sacrifice that I made, knowing that I couldn't become a registered architect one day without putting in that time. And that time I was sacrificing to do this music stuff, and so that's what I'm doing now. But at the same time, ice baby, wow. You hear that? At the same time, all right, stop. Collaborate. The interesting thing was, I think, that some of the partners in my firm are not registered. So you end up finding people who are, and you work with them, and you do what you need to do. I feel like I'll get back into architecture later in life. At this point, I also saw a window where there were things that I needed to talk about, things I needed to say, especially with respect to this revolution in Syria and what I could do for it in my position, being one of, I found myself all of a sudden one of the more well-known voices here in America. And with that came an opportunity to use my music as a rallying point for fundraising events, for awareness raising, to talk to the press, to talk to the media. Just last weekend, or 2 weekends ago, I was emceeing a big dinner for the American Relief Coalition, emceeing as in hosting. The American Relief Coalition for Syria, which was basically all the relief coalitions, all the relief organizations working inside and outside Syria, based in America, all 20 of them, came together for one night to have one big fundraising event in Washington, D.C. They asked me to host it. We ended up raising $540,000 for humanitarian relief. So I felt like, you know, certain sacrifices you make in life because you see there's certain times that you need to do things. And inshallah, I'm making the right decision right now. Yeah. Yes. One of y'all.
Okay. You mentioned that you feel like a sense of responsibility, and like you said, you are one of the more prominent voices in this genre as an Arab American. Do you feel any, I guess, pressure to be a voice for so many people, or do you still feel like you can express your personal feelings or personal opinions?
That's a very good question. It's definitely a balance. I try not to write things unless I feel them myself. I'm not going to sit here and try to predict what someone else is going through and then try to write a song about it. That's just never been the way that I do things. But I also can't deny the fact that there are